right. Hello again, everybody. It is 4:30. We're hopping into our next presentation. So presenting this presentation and the next one, we have Emy Chapleau from the University of Quebec, talking right now about the evolution of media representations of esports and video game players before, during, and after the pandemic in major Quebec daily newspapers. Emy, you are up.
Perfect. Well, hello everyone. Today I will present you, as we said, the evolution of the media representation about esports and video game players before, during, and after the pandemic. So, the World Health Organization officially declared the COVID-19 pandemic as a global pandemic on 11 March 2020. The lockdown increased the symptoms of depression, anxiety, and distress, mostly because of the prolonged loneliness. However, the effects of isolation have varied across different populations, which is exactly what some researchers saw about esports and video game players. So, video games and esports help preserve players' mental health during the quarantine by acting as a form of coping strategies. Virtual environment also maintain the social connection and socialization, which also help players rebuild a sense of belonging and community. However, lockdown has still been associated with an increased risk of cyber addiction. There is still a major difference between the science discourse and the media discourse itself regarding video game players and esports. Daily newspaper report information way faster than scientific publication does, which also influences public opinion more. This is why it's essential to study the media perspective to also understand how these discourse will influence the societal perception about gamers and esports, which is exactly what framing does. So framing is the selection and highlighting, so also called the salience, of certain perceived information about the reality to emphasize the definition of a problem or even a recommendation. The salience makes the information more visible, meaningful, and memorable to the audience. Framing can then influence how the public perceives an issue by directing their attention to certain specific information while also neglecting others' elements, which will then shape the public perceptions. So, media framing is a form of framing that is only employed in media, which is central to understand how the information are represented and also structured, which will then influence the perception of realities about their viewers. So, some researchers have suggested that maybe the influence of media framing has diminished over the year, but other studies show that the mass media framing still has a significant impact today and continues to influence beliefs, emotions, and even behaviors at an individual level. Studying the media framing also facilitates the analysis of what we call media representation. These analyses will reveal the overrepresentation and underrepresentation that we can see in media discourse, which will then shape the social perceptions of a certain group. Mostly, there's two different processes that will influence the public perception. The first one is the lexical association between certain words, and the second one is the emotional polarity of the words that are used in the articles. However, misrepresentation will still evolve over time, normally with long-term process. But short-term fluctuations can be triggered by major social events that then will lead to rapid change in misrepresentation and also the emotional tones that are used. We mean major social events such as the COVID-19 as an example. So as we said, misrepresentation can change over time, but they will still have different depending on time and also the cultural context. For example, in some American journals, gaming was associated mostly with violence, and other journals, even in America again, were talking about the recreational aspect of gaming and its more positive nature. So these representations also reveal the attitude that journalists have and the population have about gaming, which can then influence how esports programs will be perceived themselves. Some researchers said that the pandemic period had a huge impact on the misrepresentation about gamers, but again, with some cultural variation. So as we can see in the UK and in the US, journal talks about gamers and esports with a more positive tonality in 2020 compared to 2019. So only a short period of time, as we can see with the COVID-19, had a huge impact. They were mostly talking about the opportunity of social interaction and community in video games. On the other hand, media discourse in Japan also evolved during the pandemic, but by using a more negative tonality in their articles in 2020 compared to 2019, they were then more focused about the addiction aspect of video games. So in 2023, after the pandemic, some research also notes another shift in the media discourse about gaming and esports. The framing were then mostly focused on the economic growth and the player's experience. Some subtle stereotypes still remain, mostly talking about esports, which were associated with laziness and the near absence of women players. So, as we can see, media discourse about gaming and esports seems to have evolved over the year with some cultural variation. And pandemic periods also seem to have been a major social events that may have shaped the media representation about the gaming communities and esports. However, some researchers suggest that a comparative analysis between the three pandemic period, so before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and after the pandemic, is still necessary to see if there's really an evolution within media discourse over time. On the other hand, some players report they still perceive negative and stereotypical image in the media discourse. Some gamers in Quebec also share the same opinions about the stereotype they still encounter today in media discourse, including isolation, immaturity, and marginalization. However, the media representation and media discourse in Quebec daily newspaper have not been systematically measured yet. So by youth understanding that they may have been in evolution during time, so before, during, and after the pandemic, that the esports media discourse in daily newspaper in Quebec have not been measured, this is exactly the objective of our research. So to study the media representation about video games players and esports in major daily newspaper in Quebec, before, during, and after the pandemic. This study focused mainly on the title of the articles. And the reason for this specific framing is because titles have a stronger influence on the reader's interpretation and also perception, more than the complete text itself. Some studies, and even our, combine the representation of recreational gamers and esports, simply because there's still a misunderstanding about what is the real difference between esports and online gaming in media portrayal. So our analysis focused mostly on the change in the emotional tone, such as the positive and negative words that are used, and the lexical associations. Our hypothesis was the first one that there will be an evolution in the proportion of positive and negative terms that will be used to represent video game players and esports in Quebec articles, and that they will have lexical association that will differ between the three pandemic period also. For this methodology, we used 446 titles from Quebec Daily newspaper that were reaching thousands of people. These articles were selected in the platform Eureka with inclusive and exclusive criteria. So for example, we exclude the word hockey because the word gamers were also extremely used in the article to talk about really good hockey player. We also include the word sports with the word electronic if they are close together to exclude articles talking about traditional sports. Also, according to Krippendorf, if we want to do a comparative studies across time, we need to ensure that the three periods under comparisons are equivalent and comparable in their context and in their condition, which is why we see that the pandemic period lasts 810 days. So we took the 810 days before the pandemic starts as our pre-pandemic period, and the 810 days after the pandemic last and was finished for our post-pandemic period. A few methods can also be used to analyze the media representation, such as qualitative analysis. However, these type of analysis are resource heavy and really time consuming. So we decided to use a more different approach, which is an automated analysis, because they still provide faster and more efficient ways to study media from multiple perspectives, while also using different statistical approach. But because we used a automated analysis, we need for the first step to do a text preprocessing, which can significantly impact the performance and also the accuracy of automated analysis. The first technique we used is what we call alarmistization. which will reduce a word to its most basic form in the dictionary. For example, every verb will be put in their infinitive form, and every word themselves will be put in their singular and masculine form. We also use a list of stop words, which are extremely common words that doesn't provide a really semantic meaning on their own, which can be determinants, such as the, is, etc. The first statistical technique we use is what we call a form of natural language processing, which is a computerized approach for text analysis. This method can easily be used in a large corpus of data and can be beneficial to meta-framing research that want to map what are the change over time, which is exactly what we want to do by comparing our 3 different pandemic periods. More specifically, we use an NLP technique that is called sentiment analysis, which is a statistical analysis that is used to automatically identify the emotional tones of a text. It allows us to determine whether a text expresses a positive, a negative, or a more neutral tone. There is multiple ways to do sentiment analysis again, but we choose what we call the dictionary-based method. So this approach is based on a dictionary of words that contains thousands of words, which are each associated with an emotional valence, such as positive or negative, even with their intensity score. So the principle is really simple. The program search in the dictionary what is the emotional score for each word in the text. It then counts how many positive and negative words appear, and it will calculate an overall sentiment score for each individual articles or text or even title. So we can then see what is the evolution over time of the emotional polarity of the text. The second analysis we use is what we call a correspondence analysis, which is a form of factor analysis. It is a statistical method that is used to analyze and also visualize the relationship between 2 qualitative variables. We can then see the lexical association between certain words and certain categories. In this research, the categories were the 3 pandemic periods, so before, during, and after the pandemic. In other words, it allows us to see how certain words and certain categories can go together, or if they frequently appear together. So again, principle is relatively simple. We start with an abbreviated lexical table after delimitation, which is what are the words that are the most frequently used. We will then have 2 different lexical profile graph, which matrix of profile link and a matrix of profile column. So it's, in other words, words themselves will have their own matrix table, and documents, so our categories, will also have their own matrix table. These steps are really important because the correspondence analysis will see the proportion of appearance of certain words in certain categories. So the length of the articles themselves doesn't have an impact on our analysis. We then do a contingent table, so a classical keyscore test. And if the results are significant, then the association between our word and categories is not a result of chance. There is a real association between them. We will then have a very useful graphic that is called the lexical association table, which will reveal the overrepresentation and underrepresentation of certain words in the 3 categories we use. And finally, we will finish with our classical factor analysis to reduce the dimension of the information and project all of them in a factor graph. So nearby points show that they have a stronger association between these 2, which often appear together. But distant points mostly are in opposition, which means they rarely appear together. So as an example, these are not our data. This is just to show how the maps work. You can see the categories wife, which is really close to the word laundry, which means they mostly appear together and are mostly used. While the categories wife is really far away from the word finance, which means they are in opposition. They are not normally used together. For our results, let's start with the sentiment analysis. So as we can see, the proportion of negative words that were used in the articles decreased between the pre-pandemic period and the post-pandemic period. So on the other hand, the proportion of positive words that were used in the title of the articles seems to have increased in the pre-pandemic period and the pandemic period, then decreased again in the post-pandemic one. So these results show that the proportion of positive and negative words have really changed over the pre-pandemic period, which is exactly what our first hypothesis said. For the correspondence analysis result, so our chi-square test is significative, which means that the lexical associations between our two variables, so our words and our pandemic period, is real and is not the result of chance. As we can see, we have an inertia of 0.25, which represents the quality of our representation and also the strongest association between words and also our documents, and which is our categories of pre-pandemic, pandemic, and post-pandemic period. So this inertia is relatively low, but in correspondence analysis, it's normal to have a lower inertia if you have a corpus of fewer words, which is our case because we use only the title of the articles. This also appears in research using correspondence analysis in short text, like tweets on Twitter. It doesn't mean that there's nothing interesting to analyze, but it mostly means that the three pandemic periods are not totally heterogeneous. They can share some words together, but there's still stronger association between certain words and certain period because we have a really good chi-square test. So as we can see, the pre-pandemic period have a stronger association with the word cyber dependence, sports, esports, and Olympic, which is the purple slide. So these lexical association with the pre-pandemic title were mostly maybe about the competitive and the dependent nature of gaming. The pandemic period, on the other hand, have stronger association with certain words, such as good and also joue. So this word can be used in two different ways. So the first one can be jouer, which is gaming in English, and the second one is joueur, which is player. We also see a stronger association with the word virtual. However, we can also see that the word Quebec and Québécois, which is the word to express the population in Quebec, seems to be mostly associated with the pandemic and post-pandemic period, which can maybe means there's a more local lexical association between these two periods in the title. The post-pandemic period is also further away than the other two pandemic period and is also separated from them with the second axis. This can also mean that the post-pandemic period have its own unique lexical association, such as the word new and the word screen. So in conclusion, we wanted to do this study because misrepresentation about gamers reflects how the societal attitude and how the journalists and even the population see gaming and also esports. It also shapes how the public accepts this type of program and have even a stronger effect on non-gamers. It also changed, media discourse also changed during the pandemic as we saw in our results. So in conclusions, both our hypotheses were confirmed. We can see an evolution in the proportion of positive and negative words that were used in the pre-pandemic period. And we can also see different lexical association between the pre-pandemic period. However, this study still has limitation. So the first one is that we only use the title of the articles. And because we have fewer words, our inertia was low, and we need to still be careful in our interpretation. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Emy. I don't see any questions in the chat right now. I'll give people up. I lied. One just showed up. It says interesting research. Just to clarify that I understood it correctly, that the term esports is seen differently before the pandemic and after the pandemic. How do you feel this aligns with the overall cycles of esports hype and the esports winter?
I feel like there was a form of normalization about the esports themselves. So as we can see in our first result and in the articles, they were mostly talking about the new arrival in esports, mostly in Quebec, which was approximately during the 218 and 19 in the Quebec province. So there were a lot of hype and also a lot of questions about what are the esports program? What can they do to our children? What are the risks also? And then we can see that we talk less of these programs. Maybe because there is a form of normalization. People are not necessarily scared like before, which can then be explained by the emotional polarity that we saw in the three different periods. So more a negative polarity in the pre-pandemic and a more positive polarity in the post-pandemic period.
Now, a question that I will ask, because I'm interested predominantly in esports and educational settings, did you see any differences in how esports were described in terms of education versus professional esports in your analysis?
In our analysis, we combined both esports as a recreational and also a professional ones. What will have been really interesting is to see if there were different like school association, like if the school esports were mostly used. But as we saw the frequency of school esports or professional esports, these two words didn't seem to be frequent enough to be part of our analysis because we chose words that were used in 4 different articles and maybe 6 times. So I cannot sadly say what are the difference between these two because lexical association were not strong enough.
Mhm. And can you talk a little bit about where you hope to use this method in the future? Is this a methodological approach that you plan to use again moving forward?
So this methodological approach, I want to use it on my doctoral degree. So we want to see on the articles themselves what are the representation of gamers and also do some cross-cultural comparison. As we can see, there is a lot of difference in the media perspective and also the media discourse across different cultural contexts and even period of times. So we want to see maybe in other provinces of Quebec or maybe in other countries such as France, is there difference between how the gamers evolved during the pre-pandemic period?
That sounds great. I'm not seeing any other questions, and we are a little ahead of schedule, so we are going to flip to our break slide just to give everybody a chance to reset really quickly, and then we'll come back at 5 p.m. Eastern for Emy's second presentation, which we're